Hey everyone, this is Erica Lucas, your host and founding member of VEST, an organization connecting women across industries, regions, and career levels, so that together we can expedite the pipeline of more women in positions of power and influence. Welcome to another episode of the Vester podcast, where we explore the invisible barriers holding women back in the workplace and share stories of women building power collectively.
When I was assaulted by one of my colleagues, that really struck me the most because it struck me for a couple reasons. One, because it was such an egregious act. And then looking back, what also struck me was my willingness to not talk about it. Talking to my boss, who was a partner, he said, listen, you could complain about this to HR. We have those paths open, but we're not getting rid of this guy. And the sick joke of it all was, this guy had something better than coming from Harvard. He was a scratch golfer and he could have been a pro golfer. A lot of his former golf friends were pros. And that meant he was able to get my partner and all the other partners on all the golf courses around the world, Pebble Beach, Baltusrol, Augusta. And that currency was worth so much to the senior management at Goldman that they said, listen, we're not getting rid of him. So you can report it, but imagine how hard it's going to be for you to work with him after you do.
In this episode, we talked to Jamie Fiore Higgins, former managing director at Goldman Sachs, about her experience of discrimination and misogyny working for one of the largest banks in the world. We also talk about the importance of having our own identity, not tied to any job, person, or organization. This episode is sponsored by Audible, the leading provider of audiobooks, podcasts, guided wellness programs, theatrical performances, and more. Audible has over 1,000 titles for you to choose from, including our guest book, The Bully Market. Click on the link in our show notes and get a 30-day free trial plus a free credit to use on Jamie's book. To access our guest's full bio and for show notes, go to www.vesther.co/podcast. This recording was part of a more intimate coaching session with VEST members and has been repurposed to accommodate this episode. Special shout out to VEST member Heather Lawrence for moderating this session.
Your story just really resonated with me and led me to be open to exploring new opportunities in my own career. I switched roles about a month ago, and I'm super happy that I did. And I feel that you were a big part in that. So thank you.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. An author's dream. Thank you.
So I'd love to start by you telling us about your background and what led you to a career in finance and investment banking.
So I am an unlikely investment banker. So I grew up in suburban New Jersey, about an hour outside Manhattan. And when it was time to finish college, I really wanted to be a social worker. And that's because in my childhood, I had a lot of health issues stemming from a severe case of scoliosis. And for many of you, scoliosis is kind of a lot of people have that. I had a really extreme life-threatening version. And so I had benefited so much from therapists and social workers, and that's really what I wanted to do. And my parents had other plans for me. So they were immigrants, had grown up in poverty, pulled themselves out of it, worked hard, got educated, were in the, stable middle class. And the directive to me and my siblings was every generation has to do better. So I had this opportunity to go to a private college. It said, okay, well, what are you going to do? Your directive is to get the best paying job possible. And in 1998, that was Wall Street. And when I started kind of researching different options on Wall Street, all that everybody talked about was Goldman Sachs. So I made it my mission to get a job there for not the typical reasons of a real passion for the business, but to really just make my parents proud. I had felt obligation to them because all my health issues as a child turned their life around in terms of paying for the surgeries and the physical therapies and taking off of work, that I really wanted to pay them back. And that was my way to pay them back.
Goldman's been said that it's harder to get into than Harvard. What makes it so competitive, and what made you a good candidate for them?
Their marketing is just amazing. For a brand that is a financial services business, I feel like they have marketing as good as the kind of best fashion brands on Fifth Avenue in terms of curating this image that is the creme de la creme. And so through this kind of marketing pitch, in addition, that really drove just so many applicants into Goldman. And so when you have a lot of applicants, it just kind of drives competition. So there'll be tens and thousands of applicants for just 150 roles as an analyst at Goldman. What got me in the door? I think a lot of it was my blind loyalty. And I say that because I had this mission to work at Goldman. And so I did a resume drop, which now I'm aging myself, was you put your Crane's paper in a wooden box. And then, it was sent to Goldman. And I guess I had the right GPA and I was a math major. So that was just at the cusp of an attraction to the STEM courses of study. But then I think it was just my work ethic. So I had over 40 interviews for my job, 40, which seems crazy. And ironically, in 1998, it was a very robust job market. I had like 6 job offers. And that's not because Jamie Fiore was so amazing. It's just because the market was really good. And I couldn't believe I'd meet like 3 or 4 people and get a job at Prudential, and meet 4 or 5 people and get a job at Mellon. And then Goldman, it kept going. I feel like it was almost like Survivor. They wanted to see if you could kind of outlast and keep on going. I had to do math proofs in interviews. I had to do logic problems. My resume was held up to the light to make sure that the watermark was in the right place. So I think I was a really good candidate because I was in line, I was focused, and I never really thought about why is there 4 times as many interviews for this job as others? Well, it's because they're just so darn special. So it fed into that view that Goldman was better than everyone else. And I just stuck my head down and outlasted. And I feel like in a lot of ways, that kind of started my career. I was a bit of a cockroach. Nothing could kill me.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting too, the different characters you met early on, and how your experience through the interview process was so different from theirs. And you talk about the folks with pedigree and the other analysts that came in and had a just completely different experience, didn't have 40 interviews like you did.
No, and I found out early on. So at Goldman, the structure is first 6 weeks you're in training, orientation, kind of cultivating. A lot of other banks, you get dropped right into your job. At Goldman, you have this curated training program. They really indoctrinate you into the culture. And as I was interacting with these new trainees, and I would just talk about how many interviews I had, for many of them, they only had 4 or 5 interviews. And the common denominator was connection. So either their parents worked at Goldman, or their parent was a client of the firm, or their neighbor was a client of the firm or a partner at Goldman. So from very early on, it seemed like there were kind of different tracks for different people. And I was definitely on a track that required you to work a little harder than others.
You talk in your book about a lot of troubling events that happen for you, examples of assault and bias, discrimination. I think that part of it for me was really shocking to hear. I've, in my own career, haven't experienced anything to that level, but it kind of gave me pause in thinking about some smaller instances that I've experienced, but kind of curious on which for you stuck out the most.
I think for me, when I was assaulted by one of my colleagues, that really struck me the most, because it struck me for a couple reasons. One, because it was such an egregious act. And then looking back, what also struck me was my willingness to not talk about it. And my boss's view that was very unattached. So I get assaulted. My initial reaction was one of, I can't believe this happened. This is not right. That kind of moral compass that I was raised with kicked in. And then, talking to my boss, who was a partner, he said, listen, you could complain about this to HR. We have those paths open, but we're not getting rid of this guy. And the sick joke of it all was, this guy had something better than coming from Harvard. He was a scratch golfer, and he could have been a pro golfer. A lot of his former golf friends were pros. And that meant he was able to get my partner and all the other partners on all the golf courses around the world, Pebble Beach, Baltusrol, Augusta. And that currency was worth so much to the senior management at Goldman that they said, listen, we're not getting rid of him. So you can report it, but imagine how hard it's going to be for you to work with him after you do. And so that was also shocking. But the third thing that, looking back, was was even more shocking was I said, okay, and I didn't say anything, because I felt so lucky to be there. And I was getting paid outsized money. I was able to support my family of origin. I was married and hoping to have a family of my own. And that scarcity mindset around money just made me not say anything. And that, to me, looking back, is the most sad thing of all.
The golden handcuffs that you talk about. And it was like time and time again, you talked about instances like that where you were discouraged from reporting. And when you did, retaliated for it.
Yeah. And I think back to when I was writing my book, and my amazing editor at Simon & Schuster, who very gently in the comments would be like, and why didn't you leave now, Jamie? And why not now? And for the love of all good things, why not now? And so she really kind of forced me to explore the themes of why I didn't speak up. And Goldman was so good at making me believe that I was nothing without them, nothing without their role, nothing without their money. So much of my identity was tied to being a managing director at Goldman. Ironically, I never bragged about it. I never talked about it. I was very humble. I didn't want to look at me. I knew. And coming from that little girl who wore a back brace to, in school and used to get teased and mocked, it's like I had arrived. I was Jamie from Goldman. And so for me, that's really kind of what it was. And that's why now that I'm an executive coach, when I work with clients, it's so important for all of us as women to have our own identity, not tied to any job, any person, any spouse, any children, because this theme transcends careers. I have many friends who, took a step back and worked to raise their kids. The last one goes to college. They feel lost. And if we're always focused on who we are, what our values are, what our personal mission statement is, what our life's purpose is, we can bring that to any role. We can bring that to parenthood. We can bring that as a spouse. We can bring that as an employee, but yet we're a little unattached. So if any of those go away, we still know who we are. And it wasn't until I really saw that I was able to really extricate, if you will.
Yeah, and that leads exactly to what I was going to ask you next. So what was the tipping point? What made you decide, I'm done? Like, I can't do this anymore, and to leave your job? I mean, it's so brave. And I'm just...
Well, thank you. But in looking back, it was like a terrible, cowardly move. I mean, there was like almost an unraveling of me. So as all those different things happened, like the assault, there were other things where I constantly swallowed my voice, swallowed my values. It started to take a toll. And I was terribly anxious, terribly depressed. I started taking Xanax. It was initially like a rescue inhaler. You know what I mean? Like having a bad day. I was taking them like Tic Tacs. I was drinking too much. My relationship with my husband was strained. I had kids at the time. I was trying to be a good daughter, a good spouse, a good mother, a good worker. I felt like I was working my butt off at all of it. I was failing at all of it in my mind. And then enter in a senior guy in my department who was 20 years older than I was. He was an empty nester. He was divorced. And he would say to me, let's go out for coffee. I mean, I feel like it was so cliche, but I felt like I had space there to be acknowledged and appreciated in a way I wasn't getting at home because my husband had taken a step back from his career. He was strung out too. And I started having a relationship with him. And the turning point was I was out with him at his apartment, and my daughter, who is probably 4 at the time, called me with a stomach ache and wanted to know when I was coming home to snuggle her to sleep. And I was not clothed. I'm in this apartment in the city, and I'm saying, what am I doing? Like, what am I doing? What have I become? I'm a shell of who I was. And I talk a lot about my Italian grandmother who helped raise me. And I remember just saying, she'd be so ashamed of me. She saw like what I had become. And that was my real kind of moment to say, this place is killing me. And that was really when I said to my husband, you know, and I was so grateful that he forgave me because he realized that this guy, it was just a coping mechanism. It could have been cocaine. It could have been more alcohol. It was just, and I'm dating myself here. Maybe some of you will appreciate this, but it was my Calgon take me away moment. For those Gen Xers, you'll understand that reference. It's a funny commercial from the 80s with this woman who has this hard day working and mothering and goes into the bath and is transported in this bathtub, Calgon take me away. And it was my escape. And what I realized was I just needed to escape from Goldman. And that kind of started the plan for me to get out.
I think it's spot on with, you know, you're talking about your husband and him being able to see it for what it was.
So grateful for good therapists and a very open and forgiving husband. But I think it's also because he was strung out too. He was miserable. He was drinking too much. He never walked into Goldman's doors, and that place was affecting him too. Yeah. So I think we kind of both realized that this environment wasn't working for us. And we just kind of had to, I say it's like we had to kind of like, knock down our house of marriage and rebuild it. And looking back now, it's been a long time. It's the single best thing that happened to us because it really forced us to look at each other and say, the road's a fork here. Are we going in alone? Or are we going to work together and do it with each other for each other? And so it was the best thing that ever happened to us in retrospect.
And then, you're so open with him, but then also with the world, and curious on what made you decide to write this book. And, was he supportive of that? And, how was that process for you?
I didn't leave. I left Goldman about 6 years ago with no intention of writing the book. But I was so depressed when I left. So kind of going back to roles, it wasn't until I left that I really realized how tied I was to that role. And I felt like I was nothing and I was no one. And I was so down. Like I couldn't get out of bed down. Like I would get the kids off to school. I had an infant at home. When she slept, I slept. And so I threw myself into volunteerism because I said, I just need to be busy. I need to kind of get active. And so I was a bit of a unicorn because in my area in suburban New York, it seemed like a lot of women either backed out of working before they had kids or while they had kids or kept working. So to see a woman who kind of is now available to volunteer, who's 40, I was a bit of a unicorn. People would say to me, well, why did you leave? You seem like you were at the height of your career. And so I would tell them little anecdotes. And I'll never forget, I was planting at the preschool with another mom. And I told her about how when I went to the lactation rooms to pump for my youngest child, how the guys in the desk would moo at me. And they would leave cartons of milk on my desk and little stuffed cows. And don't get me wrong, I knew it was messed up. But when I saw her reaction, I was like, wow, this is really messed up. And then, all around me, Me Too was coming up. And I saw that there was a real appetite and encouragement of real stories. A celebration of being honest and open. And I said, maybe this is something I should just write out for myself, just to kind of put it out there. And it was really kind of my side gig. I wasn't getting paid for it, but I had an infant. So, I wrote my book in 15-minute increments in the car line, at dance class when I was waiting. And I finally finished it. And then it was, now what? And so I looked at my husband and I really realized through the exploration of the book, how it had so much more to do with themes of identity, themes of power, manipulation. And I said, you know what? We have to shine a light on this. But it was very important to me not to just shine a light on what I had endured, but what I perpetuated. Because yes, we've talked a little bit about some of the bad things that happened to me, but I did bad things. I cheated on my husband. I didn't help women. I didn't stand up for women. And I thought, my gosh, isn't this fascinating? Take a woman, 22, wanted to be a social worker, sweet as could be, drop her into this world, and look what happens. I was almost like a case study. And so I wanted to really kind of shine light on large, powerful organizations, how they wield their influence and how it affects people, and how in this country, what we do is so much of what people think who they are. And so, so he was really supportive. My mom wasn't sure at first. She wasn't sure at first, but by the time I was done with the book, she's like my biggest fan now. She just turned 80 and she's just like giving my book out to her friends and, loves it. And I just feel like our stories are more similar than different. And I know, I anticipated this, but then since I wrote the book, I've heard from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women who have seen part of themselves in my story. The sacrifices we make, trying to kind of survive in a male-dominated world, the power of identity. And so I'm really glad I did it. I spent close to 20 years of my life muzzled by Goldman Sachs. They controlled what I said. They controlled how I reacted. And it just feels so good to make this 180 and just say, I'm just telling you what happened. I'm not claiming this is the experience of every woman at Goldman or on Wall Street, but this is my story. And it feels so good to just read from my own script now instead of someone else's.
And now that you have this out there, have you experienced retaliation because of it? And just kind of curious on the other side, you talk about all the women hundreds of women that have come forward and have shared experiences, but curious on the other hand too, on the backlash that you may have received.
Yeah, I heard from Goldman through a canned statement that they have shared over and over again that they disagree with my characterization of the firm. I wrote the book. I changed names. Many of my characters are composites because I did not feel it was in service of the message to shame anybody. If they read my book, they know who they are. I don't need the rest of the world to know. To me, it's not about that because I did bad things too. And even for the guy who assaulted me, although it was wholly inappropriate, I have to pause and wonder what was going on in his life then. Was he on drugs? Well, you know what I mean? Like if I'm going to say that environment changed me, I have to offer that grace to others. So Goldman also said they won't acknowledge my book because the people are anonymized. I have experienced subtle backlash. Okay. And I say subtle because I've had a lot of great coverage in the press. So many papers have written about my book. I was on the Today Show. I was on Dr. Phil. I was on CNN. So I've gotten a lot of love. I was on Dax Shepard's podcast. So I've gotten a lot of love in that way. But what happens is I'll get messages from women that say, for example, the New Jersey Board of Women Executives, we're all about empowerment. We'd love for you to come and talk. Oh my gosh, I would love to come and talk. We'll have a conversation about what we're going to talk about. And then all of a sudden I get an email. I'm sorry, it's not going to work out. We're afraid of backlash from Goldman. That has happened time and time again. Different affinity networks at different large institutions, different women's affinity networks. And I find it so ironic because this is the population that's going through things, but like large, powerful organizations like Goldman are everywhere. And they have such a large philanthropic arm. They do so many good things, but they're investing money in a lot of these not-for-profits. Well, they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. Yeah. So it's this kind of subtle thing, which has surprised me because going back to my earlier point that I felt silenced by Goldman because I was an employee. I understand why others would, but oh my gosh, directors of nonprofits, I didn't even imagine that Goldman's tentacles are there. And the ironic thing is, yes, my story is about Goldman because that was my setting, but this story is just about women in the workplace and what happens at large, powerful organizations. And the hundreds of messages I got, they were from large businesses, private businesses, politics, media, some super small businesses, because guess what? You only need two people to have a power dynamic that's exploited. So this is not just about one industry or one company, and yet there's this reluctance. And that's been discouraging, but yet has made me appreciate organizations like you even more, because now I realize how courageous it is just for you to have me here to talk about it.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation, and your honesty is so refreshing.
And you know what, Heather, what I found is, let's just easy math. 50% of women are in the workforce. Okay. I feel like most women have experienced something, right? So this is a commonplace occurrence. It is so taboo to talk about. Mm-hmm. That's been the fascinating thing. How can we even think about creating a solution for us now, for the next generation, right? I have 3 young daughters. If we can't even talk about the problem, we can't even give a voice to the problem. And it's not like I'm looking for a bunch of people to get on my bandwagon and wholly agree with me. I love when I'm in conversation with groups and people push back on me. I love that because that means something about my story they're reacting to, and that means we can talk about it, and maybe their thinking might be shifted or maybe not, but at least we're discussing. And so to me, how can we even come up with a solution if we're not even willing to have an honest dialogue about the problems?
Yeah, and you talk about daughters. I have 2 daughters myself. Curious on your thoughts on them and them entering the workforce and advice you'll have for them.
For me, it's, when I first started at Goldman, going back to the comment about marketing, I'll never forget being on campus. I went to a women's college and the senior women partner came and said, introduced Goldman and said their marketing tagline was minds wide open. We want anthropology majors. We want English majors. We want open-minded. We want you. We want your perspective. We want to break through the glass ceiling. It was an amazing marketing pitch. I was like, I'm there. What I want to tell my daughters is, and my son, is eyes wide open. Let's get very clear on what we want to do, why we want to do it, the organizations we're aligning with, and why. And know at the end of the day, sounds a little cheesy, but we are the CEO of our own careers. Going back to the theme of identity, you always work for yourself. So to me, when you're going into the workforce, you have to do a value proposition, a value analysis. What am I giving in terms of my time, my energy, right? Is it stressful? Is there a long hours? What am I getting back? Money's a big part of it. We need money, right? We also need passion. We also need flexibility. I recently talked to this sweet, sweet woman, a Columbia senior, goes to Columbia University in New York, has a job at Goldman, said, I read your book over winter break and I am petrified. I don't want to go. I accepted my offer, Jamie. I don't want to go. And I said, no, that's not the takeaway. The takeaway is learn from my mistakes, know what you might encounter, be prepared with your reaction, with your language, and know you can always redesign it. Maybe it works for you for a year. Then guess what? If it doesn't, redesign. Goldman Sachs every year, as I'm sure every large company does, has performance reviews. You should have your own performance review. How is this company treating me? Am I getting paid enough? Am I feeling passionate enough? Okay, you know what? Maybe you're getting paid a ton of money and you're not very passionate. Maybe that works for a while. Then you can redesign. You aren't stuck. The big lesson from my career was I thought I was a prisoner at Goldman Sachs. I thought I couldn't leave. The sick joke was that the door was never locked. It was a prison in my own mind. So I really want to empower people in the workforce to know they are in charge and they can always redesign. So that's the kind of empowerment I want to give my kids, my son included, as they enter in. And then as they continue, because the rule always applies.
Yeah, that's so spot on. They teach us to think that way in an interview, and you're going in there and you want the position, but also think, is this the right thing for me? But I think that carries on to after the interview, you get hired, you're there, you have to, like you said, reevaluate that often. And what is this doing for me? What's in this for me besides the money?
That's right. And do it with other trusted advisors. So if you're the CEO of your own career, get yourself a board of directors, not people you work with, because they're going to be in that same culture and they might be blinded to the same issues that you don't see, whether it be good friends from college, trusted family members, people for you to look at and say, all right, this is what I think's working for me. What do you think? Just so you're kind of going in with an informed and an empowered view.
I'm going to open it up to questions shortly, but kind of wanted to circle back before we touched on it a couple of times, and that scarcity mindset, women not always helping other women. And so I find that topic so interesting. And so wanted to kind of get some of your thoughts on that.
I think that a lot of organizations are able to kind of maintain this patriarchy, if you will, because they set up the structure of the organization that limits opportunities for women, which then gives women this view of a scarcity mindset. So, at Goldman, being a woman felt like a zero-sum game. If I'm winning, Heather, then you have to lose. We both can't win together, which was ironic because all the guys were winning together. And I always reflect upon a women's network event where it was for female partners, managing director women, upcoming vice presidents that were kind of on that managing director track. It was this hoity-toity event. It was, in our building, at our rooftop, cocktail party bar, and all the women were around the four guys in the room. And I remember looking around and being like, for real, but I was a victim of it, because when women would complain to me about this guy's making me feel uncomfortable, this guy, I wouldn't go out on a date with him, and now he's messing my relationship with my clients, I would speak up. I would always try. And then my boss would say, all right, well, do you really want to put your neck out for this girl? Because I'm calculating your bonus right now. And time again, I would shut up. And so that's why I think organizations like Vest are so important, because it is this affinity women's network outside of your businesses. So you can really approach it with generosity. that whatever, and listen, I hope for all of you that whatever organizations you are, there is an abundance mindset with regards to opportunity. But if there isn't, when it comes to women, well, now you have this organization. And I'm sure some of these women could be your board of directors. And to make sure you're like looking at things with clear eyes wide open. But it's a shame because I think Goldman perpetuates the manipulation and the patriarchy with scarcity mindsets among women, opportunity, and money. And those are the three things that keep you silent and keep you in your seat.
Yeah. I know for myself, and we touched on this too today, that, my whole life, I feel like my whole identity is tied to my career and my resume. And, I had, when I moved during the pandemic from California to Oklahoma, it was 6 months where I wasn't working and I just felt so lost. And so you shared that earlier, kind of after you left, kind of going through that and who am I? What do I do? And so I think maybe before we open it up for questions, talk a little about what you're doing now and your coaching and where folks can find out more about that.
I am so happy to report that the grass is greener. Like the grass is so much greener. I miss Wall Street a little bit, meaning I wish that organization had been structured in a way that I would have been able to continue to survive and thrive. But I'm glad that I left and realized that what made me so good with my clients and, my P&L and what made me such a high performing person, when I walked out the door, I took it all with me. And so once I kind of realized that, I was able to kind of carve a new life for myself. So I'm an executive coach, which I absolutely love because I feel like I can kind of do what I wish Jamie Fiore had experienced at 24. I wish when I coach women, it's like it's a way for me to kind of coach myself and also coach the women I didn't help at the time. And so much of life is mindset. I always say the most valuable real estate in the whole world is the space between your two ears. And so it's just really important that we are aligned with our values, with our goals, and kind of keep that mindset. And listen, it's not perfect, right? But it's a muscle. You have to keep on working. And so I really love working with my clients and seeing them grow and achieve and seeing them break through barriers of limitations that they've been struggling with. So my website is jamiefiorehiggins.com. There's a contact me button. The grass is greener. And I love working with clients because I feel like I've been there. So I get it. And I know what it's like to kind of walk the floors and deal with the hierarchies. And it's a way for me to kind of get that social worker experience that I always wanted to help people and marry my real life experience. So I look back a lot, the big joke in my book is I wasn't really frivolous with my money. I was the TJ Maxx suit wearing gal, not really into the Louboutins and the Jimmy Choos or any of that, but I was really frivolous with my time. And I got my job offer at 21. I left when I was 40. And so I don't want to be frivolous with my time anymore. And I really want to make my mark by highlighting the themes of my book, talking about the importance of workplace equality, and then helping those in the workforce survive and thrive.
Yeah. And I mean, it's come full circle almost. It's you started wanting to do social work and it's almost because now you've had this 20-year experience that you're able to, from that perspective, give back.
Yes.
And help women that maybe you didn't have the opportunity to while you were at Goldman. So that's wonderful.
I'm going to open it to questions. So first one is from Monica. I'm curious if and how Jamie's experience affected her relationship with her parents. She entered the investment banking to pay them back, and it really changed her. What kind of conversations do you have after that about that?
So I think, so my parents were a bit older for me, they had me in their mid to late 30s. And they were very much the mindset of you get a job for life, you work 40 years at your company, you get your pension, you get your brass ring. And a big mantra in my family was suck it up. So even when I was recovering from my back surgery and, it was painful, it was always suck it up, push through the pain, be grateful. There's so many people worse off than you. And I'll never forget on the way to Jersey City, New Jersey, where I used to park my car to take the ferry to Lower Manhattan, there was a Jordache factory, like the jeans. And every morning I would drive by the Jordache factory at 5 a.m. And there would be droves of people with their paper lunch bags going to work their shift. And that would just reinforce to me, Jamie, shut up. You're so lucky. Like, my father would say, well, it's not like they're beating you. And my brother would say, they're beating her with the money stick. So like in some ways there was how bad could it be? It's Wall Street. It's a white collar job. How bad could it be? So that's also what kind of really kept me going. It wasn't until the end when I had my affair, and then I actually had I had a miscarriage, a later miscarriage that was very physically, it was really bad. Like I had to be hospitalized. I lost a lot of blood, and the doctor wanted me to take off for 2 weeks. And because they were afraid, like I would go into cardiac arrest because I had lost so much blood. And I went back after like 4 days. And then my mom was saying, what? It literally took that long. It was almost like ignore the cracks. And then when I started to break, then they noticed. And then they said, enough's enough. But for my family, going back to scarcity mindsets, my family grew up with a real scarcity mindset around money. So my father's father, my grandfather, committed suicide when my dad was a young boy because his business failed kind of after the Great Depression. And so my father basically went from like a small single family cottage to living into like a tenement house. And that always stuck with him. And sadly, my dad died just like 4 months ago. But even before he died, my mom had treated my kids to tickets to a local theater. They were like $30 a ticket. And my father said, oh, Angela, we can't afford that. Even till the day he died, there was that, you don't have enough money. And that's really what kept them pushing me, because I inherited that fear from my father, unfortunately. I inherited a lot of amazing things from him, but I inherited that fear. So, it was a work in progress with them. I think they kind of understood later on when it was really taking its toll on me that I needed to go. But still that, even when I left, my dad said, oh, Jamie, you're giving up so much money. Like, when are you going to ever make that money again? So still, and that's why I think it's very important as parents that we really work on abundance mindsets with our kids about everything. There's always extra opportunity. You could always make more money. You can't make more time. And that's my really perverted view when I worked there. I thought money was finite and time was infinite, but it's the opposite. We don't have that much time. We can always make more money. So anyway, that's kind of what I got from my parents.
What are some early signs to watch out for you to understand if your values align with the company or not, especially when one is early on in their career and companies like Goldman Sachs have created the illusion of what is the dream job?
I think nowadays I think information is so much more democratized with the onslaught of social media. So it's like people now share openly what's going on, from the bathroom of corporations. So I don't think companies like Goldman can kind of control that kind of stellar cultivated image that they could back in the day. So I think number one, do your research and do your research across. I'm not saying believe every TikTok video you watch, but let it inform you, right? There's research. There's Glassdoor, I think, has also reviews, that kind of thing. But I think when you're in your career, we as people have to get very clear on what our values are, very clear. And it always points back to your values. Fulfillment always goes back to your values. And again, fulfillment in relationships, careers, hobbies, whatever. So get very clear with your values. And a lot of it's a gut check. You'll know when what you're experiencing is not aligned with your values. And I'm not saying run out the door if it is. I'm saying recognize it, own it, recognize it. And when you're doing the analysis on your job, consider that a little bit of a risk. Okay, this place isn't really aligning with my values. Okay, is the reward worth that risk? Reward being money, passion, opportunity. And again, always knowing you can redefine it. Listen, the best careers are one where your values are honored and shared by the organization. But life isn't perfect, right? As long as we kind of have our eyes wide open and know what we're willing to sacrifice for the greater good, that it's really the awareness is what you need.
I have a question. I love everything about you, and thank you for sharing and being so honest. But I'm curious about where was the presence of when that happened and you were going through that of a female friend or a mentor. I mean, and I'm saying that because I have lunch with a coworker mentor, and I was telling something about a client, and she pointed out to me like, so why are you doing that? And like she made me see something that I honestly was doing it, that I was surprised I was doing it because I'm against it, but somehow we fell into well, it's just a client and I don't want to look bad. But because of her comment, it made me realize, yeah, this is not right. So I'm wondering, what was the presence of a female friend when this was happening?
Yeah. The mentors, and I still talk to my mentor to this day, but when the mentor is within the organization, we were both wearing distorted glasses. So it's like she really couldn't see it with clarity. I did have friends, but I would minimize them. I mean, my best friend would say to me for years, Goldman Sachs is your abusive boyfriend. Why won't you just leave? And in truth, as much as I loved her and respected her, she was a trust fund kid. She comes from money. She has family generational wealth. And there was part of me that was like, well, easy for you to say. You can follow your dreams. You can get yourself out of a bad position. So unfortunately, she was the only one and literally asked me for years and years to leave. But there was part of me that just didn't respect her because I didn't view that she needed to work like I needed to work, if that makes sense. And my mentors at the firm, they were going through their own nonsense too. That when you're in a toxic organization, it's all relative. We normalized so much of what we experienced as just, this is the workplace. And the other thing is, it's the only place I ever knew. And Goldman at the time, really, a lot of people were just lifers. So when you're always in this environment, it was almost like we didn't even know what a normal, healthy workplace was because none of us had ever seen it.
If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review and subscribe to our podcast for future episodes. You can also join the conversation by becoming a VEST member. Go to www.vester.co and apply today.